Experts say better collaboration and communication is needed in order to be more prepared for the next potential pandemic. The expert panel of doctors and researchers says disease surveillance, hospitalization data, and research findings need to be communicated much more effectively between the provinces, the territories, and the federal government. Well, they note the threat of disinformation and the importance of sharing information quickly to build back public trust. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Dr. Fahad Razak, one of the 6 experts who compiled this report. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. Obviously, very important stuff here. Let's talk about the key findings of this report and what are some of the recommendations to improve this communication?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So this was the work of 6 people and a chair that spent about 6 months going across the country and speaking to about 300 stakeholders. And we really wanted to find the key recommendations that would help us prepare better for a next crisis. And that could be an infectious disease, but it could be wildfires, it could be flooding, it could be a solar flare, for example. And the key recommendations were we need to work more cohesively as a country. Because of the way our government is structured, you have decisions that are made federally, perhaps different decisions that are made provincially or within a territory. And often there's a discontinuity between those that can make it very difficult for the public. And there's often a lack of transfer of information between these areas. And part of the key response to a crisis, any crisis, is that advanced preparation in order to ensure those lines of communication are very strong, transfer of information is very strong, and that you provide information back to the public so they know in as close to real time as possible what you are seeing scientifically and on the policy side.
And part of what you've highlighted is that there's only so much that you can do in the middle of a crisis. So part of this report talks about having a single permanent scientific advisory group. My question is, who gets to decide who's on that advisory group? And I ask this because, you know, you look back throughout the pandemic, and there was a lot of doctors who were vilified, discredited, and even canceled and lost their job because they were simply asking legitimate questions about the science and the data. So when it comes to the differing of medical opinions, who gets to be on this panel?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and you're right. It was a major source of discord over the course of the pandemic. Who are the experts? The proposal here is to follow a model that was seen in the United Kingdom, where ahead of a crisis, you put together a panel, you publicly release who they are and the profiles and why they are experts, whether it's in biologic science or nuclear science or communication, whatever the areas are that require comprehensive expertise. You allow the public to see that, have that conversation in advance. The last thing you want is on top of a crisis, like the crisis we just experienced, where by every estimate, more people died in Canada than in World War II in Canada. So a major mortality event. You don't want those arguments happening in the middle of the crisis. You want to have that information out ahead of time, including who's on such a panel. Now, who would put it together? We have elected officials. So I think the suggestion here, and I think it would make a lot of sense, are that panel should be composed of recommendations from elected officials, federally and provincially, and the best scientific advice from the scientific community, large universities, and other areas of expertise.
And Doctor, lastly, part of your report talks about building back trust. And I think you can appreciate in hindsight, a lot of trust was broken from the medical community, from the media throughout the pandemic, and especially when it comes to a lot of the Orwellian, draconian lockdown measures. There was a lot of not bad information, but we were learning a lot about COVID as it was unfolding. And when you look at things like Dr. Anthony Fauci, the 6-foot rule, he said this was just sort of appeared and wasn't based on data. We had information about masks that you couldn't get COVID or transmit it. That turned out not to be true. If you were vaccinated, that you couldn't get COVID or you couldn't transmit it. That turns out not to be accurate. So how do you build that trust back when there was a lot of holes in the science?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're raising some of the critical errors in retrospect that we had in terms of recommendations. But remember, this was a brand new illness, never existed before 2019. The decision-making had to be done in real time based on best available evidence, and science will not always get it right. The goal of science is to use the best available evidence to get the best estimate of what you should do at that time. Part of trust is releasing information we believe in as close to real time as possible to say, here's why we're recommending it based on what evidence we have, which at sometimes, masking as an example, or the 6-foot rule as an example, could be based on very little available evidence, but based on our best estimates based on what we're seeing. And I think the best way of establishing trust with the public is to show that information, show where where you are more certain and sometimes less certain, and show when the recommendations change why they are changing. Because we know that you will never get it right all the time, but we think the best thing you can do for the public and for a policymaker is to say, here's what we're recommending. This is the best we can do right now. This may change, and we will let you know as soon as we can if new information arises.
Dr. Fahad Razak, we appreciate your time on this. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.